Tady Havel, slyšíte mě? Čím dřív začneme, tím líp. Mohl bych jen maličkost. Pokud budeme držet pohromadě, budeme se mít všichni aspoň trochu rádi, navzájem si naslouchat a jeden druhého chápat, nemůžou proti nám nic. Přeji vám mnoho úspěchů.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This session will be in English. Mainly because we have a very distinguished guest who I will introduce in a minute. There is, we are just after the 17th of November. Everybody's discussing Havel, Velvet Revolution, Havel's legacy. This evening we will deal with one part of that legacy, and that is the legacy of Václav Havel in foreign policy, particularly his ideas, his approach, to what extent that legacy is still alive. And the reason we're doing the second reason is not just after 17th of November. There's a project that has been going on for about a decade about Havel's foreign policy. And the main organizer of this group, which has now completed its task, is Pavel Seifter, who used to work with Václav Havel at the castle in the foreign department in the 90s, and then became ambassador to the United Kingdom. And Pavel will give us a short view of what the project was about, and we will then follow in our discussion. Our discussion is a kind of follow-up or a conclusion or extension of your project. If you
can. Thank you. The idea of the project originated shortly after Václav Havel died. And the originator was Martin Palouš. Is he here? He's not here. Here? No. Oh, that's odd. Anyway, what was the idea about? It was mainly about two things. As an archivist, archivist of, later the library, Havel's library. You didn't hear me? No. I can easily repeat. Thank you. So I ended with talking about Martin. And his idea was that Havel is not with us anymore, but there are people who worked together with him, who knew him very well, assisted him, and co-created his foreign policy. If we wait too long, they won't be here either. Luckily, these people were all 20 or even 25 years younger, so they are here. So what to do with it? Let's set up some mechanism to record it, what the people do remember and what their views are. So that was the first step. And the result is quite a good collection, a record of recordings, something like an oral history archive, which is still going on. It's not finished. The second idea was that people did talk and write about Havel a lot. And it continues. There are biographies and other books. But one aspect of his presidential time is not represented really very much, and that is foreign policy. So that was the second aspect of it. Now, what comes out easily, if you think about Havel's foreign policy, is that it's somehow connected to morals. Morals is a key. And although everybody knows about it and has attitudes about it. What it really meant and how it worked is not so well known. So the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is human rights. Well, that's how we landed here now. It's not only human rights. It's quite a bulk of things. All things that have to be discussed, all things that have to be remembered, and all things that have to get some more energy, especially in our times now. So, having said all that, I think it's time for me to thank. Not too close, don't be afraid. To thank the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, who supported us, and to thank also the Faculty of Social Sciences at the university, which gave us a home, and then at the end also I want to thank the library for hosting us today and supporting anything that concerns Václav Havel and the history of his life and deeds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pavel, and thank you for providing the inspiration for this meeting. I will briefly introduce the speakers and ask a couple of questions to start the discussion. Michael Ignatieff, I think we know each other since our student days, so that goes quite a long way. I will very briefly just say that he's professor of history at the Central European University. He was a rector of Central European University. He had a number of other distinguished academic positions. He was at Harvard the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights, which I think is very close to the subject we will be discussing. He had a brief incursion into Canadian politics, but which is interesting for us, intellectuals actually getting engaged into politics. That was Havel's fate, but that was others have also felt the compulsion to get engaged, not just to discuss, but to actually get engaged in the political debate. Our paths have occasionally crossed, particularly in the 1990s during the wars in former Yugoslavia. And Michael was very influential in shaping the debate about the international response to Bosnia, to the situation in Kosovo. And we were both part of the International Commission on Kosovo, which was chaired by the Judge Richard Goldstone, whom some of you may know. He's a prolific writer, out of many books. Perhaps for this audience, I would mention his biography of Isaiah Berlin. This is one of my favorite books, and I understand it has been republished recently. Great book about a great political philosopher, and he has most recently published and have a Czech version translated here on his book on consolation. So there is for Czech readers, there is a possibility to read him also in Czech. For all these reasons, it's a great pleasure to welcome Michael at the Havel Library. We have two. Michael will introduce, and we have two discussants. One is Martin Palouš. I mean, you all know him. He was one of the part of the dissident movement. He's co-founder of the Civic Forum. He was a deputy foreign minister, ambassador to the US, ambassador to the UN. So he has a he comes from a milieu close to Havel, but he has also been actually involved in practicing foreign policy of the Czech Republic. So that is an interesting contrast and combination for our discussion. And Jiri Pehe, whom you know also from his public intervention, his writings, in his commentaries, but he was working with Václav Havel in the 90s at the castle as head of the political department of Václav Havel. And until recently, he was the director of the New York University program in Prague. So these are our three participants. I will very briefly just say a few words about the subjects or the question. It has been referred to by Pavel, just mentioned it, that for Havel, ethics is the entry ticket into politics. That is the moral imperative that brings him, that drives him to become engaged in public affairs. And he called it in one of his essays, responsibility as fate. So this is something that he has accepted and that he has kept throughout his career. The question is, to what extent the legacy of dissent, civic engagement, human rights, all that aspect, to what extent that is meaningful and helps us understand his foreign policy once he became president. It's the old debate about values and interest, and there's Václav Havel had a answer to that, which I can quote: "Hope is not that something will turn out all right, but something has meaning independently of how it will turn out." Well, that is a dissident posture. Can you still say that as a president, as a head of state in charge of foreign policy? That is at least a question. You know, the old debate about ethics of conviction and ethics of responsibility. That was Max Weber's classic question. Well, for Havel, ethics of conviction is my ethics of responsibility. But that would be his answer. But yeah, can a dissident posture fit in international affairs when you are head of state? The second question for me is derived from a meeting that Havel himself organized every year at the castle, and it was called Forum 2000. And I had the honor of moderating for years the opening debate. And that year, 1999, the opening debate was between Václav Havel and Henry Kissinger. And Havel then outlined his case for what is, for better word, known as humanitarian intervention. What is happening in Kosovo is unacceptable. It has to be ethnic cleansing, has to be stopped, etc. This was a classic argument. Kissinger's reply was, I understand and sympathize with your position. However, I would be prepared to accept doing something about it if you present to me the map of the Balkans that you want to achieve at the end of that humanitarian intervention. In other words, back to the thinking about the consequences of intervention and your action. So this is, and perhaps a third theme, very important, perhaps will be the most important in our discussion. Okay, Havel's position about human rights as a center feature of his understanding of foreign policy. I'm not saying the only feature, but yeah, clearly at the core of his understanding of what that should be. That was a post-89 world. It was the triumph of democracy, human rights, and the idea that globalization was not just economic; it was also a globalization of democracy and human rights. There was this understanding. Well, I don't have to dwell on the fact that we live in a different world, and that in those days, humanitarian interference. Today, when people talk about interference, they either mean threats or actual reverting to war. Yeah, that's the idea. What is the relevance of that Havel's understanding of foreign policy and human rights in a world that we live in today? So. I give the floor first to Michael Ignatieff, and we will have the two respondents after that.
Thank you, Jacques. It's very nice to be in this room again. I'm susceptible to rooms. I'm very susceptible to this room. I love being here and being with my Czech friends and this very distinguished Czech friends at that. I'm going to give you the outsiders, the non-Czech, the external view of how I see Havel's achievement. And I'm sure the insiders here are going to see it differently. And I hope that will stimulate a discussion. From the outside, President Havel's chief foreign policy achievement was to anchor the Czech Republic in NATO and the European Union, to confirm the Western orientation of the Czech Republic, to confirm its distance from Russia. And that stance didn't simply impact the Czech Republic, it affected the entire transition of the Poles, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, everybody. So from an exterior point of view, his strategic decision that the Czech Republic belonged in the West, belonged in the EU, belonged in NATO, was in a certain way the most consequential of his foreign policy ideas. And the reason it's especially significant, it seems to me, is that he saw a connection between stabilizing the Czech democratic transition and anchoring it in these international institutions. That is, he saw a connection between making sure that the Czech democratic transition was safeguarded and protected by an American NATO-based security guarantee and by entry into the European market. And this would guarantee that the Czech Republic would not slide back into a so-called Russian sphere of influence, and its economy would not slide out of integration into the global economy. And these are very, very major strategic orientations that had an enormous consequences for the Czech Republic. He wasn't alone in the Czech Republic in thinking about that. He had some pretty smart people working for him who believed the same orientation, but he deserves credit for those choices. I would argue as an outsider, these were the right choices then, and they look like pretty good choices now. And he had the support of his people then, and I think by and large, those orientations remain anchored in Czech political preferences now. There's lots he couldn't have anticipated. I think he could not have anticipated that Putin would invade Ukraine and thus put the security of this country and the whole of Europe in jeopardy. I don't think he'd be surprised by it, but I think he couldn't have predicted that this would happen. I think he would be dismayed at the number of Eastern European states who've chosen a kind of quasi-neutral, even accommodating and complicit stance in relation to Putin. I'm thinking of Viktor Orban. I think he'd be depressed by that, but not necessarily surprised. One of the things that I think an outsider sees about this is that Havel's position on this and the whole Czech position on integrating into NATO and EU is a rebuttal of a very important argument that has circulated in the United States for decades now. And that argument, which we associated with John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago and with Steve Walt, a colleague and friend of mine at the Kennedy School, this argument maintains that one of the strategic mistakes that the West made post-89 was to push NATO expansion eastward to the Russian frontier, and that this basically began to stabilize the possibility of integrating Russia in a post-89 security world. The aggressive eastward expansion of NATO threatened Russian vital interests and began to precipitate Putin out of the international liberal order. So that basically by 2008, in Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, Russia has ceased to be a partner in an international liberal order. It's become a renegade insurgent against that order. And the Mearsheimer-Walt argument is that American aggressive expansion eastward is one of the precipitating causes of that decisive change in Russia's strategic posture. Whoops, excuse me. Sorry, whoops. I'm terribly sorry. Sorry. Normal service is now resumed, my apologies. So, what you think about Havel's decisions affects what you think about a different question, but a related question, which is, did the United States make a strategic mistake in pushing NATO eastwards in the 1990s and bringing the Czechs, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Baltic states into NATO? My criticism of that view of Mearsheimer and Walt would be as follows. It's important to remember that Mearsheimer and Walt are actually critics of American foreign policy, and some of their criticisms were very trenchant and effective. But here's the criticism, and you've got to remember here, I'm a Canadian. And so a Canadian has a very sharp sensitivity to a thing that Americans do, which no disrespect to, there may be some wonderful Americans in the audience, and hats off to you, we love you, good neighbors, good friends. But Americans, because they are essentially an imperial people, have an incapacity to understand the agency of smaller countries. In the American view of the world, and it's a view held by left critics of American policy equally with conservative defenders of American foreign policy, is the only agent in the world, the rainmaker who makes the weather, is the United States. And therefore, eastward expansion is driven essentially by American strategic interests or American folly or American inattention. Whatever the motives, the only motives that matter are American. And the point I would make here, and this is where Havel's an important figure, is that view, the Mearsheimer-Walt view, systematically denies to Eastern Europe, to the Czechs, to the Hungarians, to the Poles, to the Baltic states, to all of the agents of this, or their agency. It says, so the analysis of Eastern expansion by NATO is all push and no emphasis on pull. No emphasis on the passionate demand of Eastern Europeans who said basically, and Havel was the most articulate expresser of this view, we cannot have a democratic transition in this part of the world unless we have a security guarantee. We can't have an economic future at all unless we're in the European Union. The pull factor here is, in my view, as important as the push factor. And Havel understands that, and a lot of American policymakers don't. So there's a certain number of American policymakers who now think, well, NATO expansion eastward was a strategic mistake because we pushed provoked the Russian bear, and look at the problem we've got now. We've got a war in Ukraine. There is a line of argument that goes there. And Havel's example is the counter-argument. This country and all the countries of Eastern Europe had historical agency. And Havel used the fact that he was a dissident, he used the fact that he'd been a political prisoner, and he used cannily the fact that American foreign policy at that time gave considerable moral attention and moral respect to those who had suffered human rights abuses. And this was an element of American foreign policy since Carter. And Havel understood how to use the moral card to gain the leverage with American policymakers that said, basically, we have got to have NATO membership if we're going to stabilize and secure the democratic transition in the Czech Republic. Now, so that's, I think, one of the reasons why Havel's historic contribution, NATO and EU entry, are so important, not simply for the Czech Republic, but for how we understand the entire nature of the post-'89 transition and how we should restore agency to all the smaller countries that are often ignored in American policy analysis. The second point I would like to make, and this will be what I end with, is that if you look at the world we're in now and ask yourself a kind of hypothetical, what if President Havel was still in the castle and he was dealing with J.D. Vance? Imagine a situation when Václav Havel goes to the Munich Security Council conference and he sits and listens to J.D. Vance's speech in February. What he would have heard from J.D. Vance would be very surprising, which is J.D. Vance said, America's relation to Europe is not fundamentally a relation of alliance partnership on the basis of common values of democracy and human rights. The American relation to Europe should henceforth be driven by the ideological convictions of our administration. That is to say, our friends in Europe are those who subscribe to the same political values that we subscribe to. And therefore, our friends in Europe, you'll be surprised, folks, are AFD, Wilders in the Netherlands, and on we go. And don't tell me that, Britain is our natural ally here, because what we hear is that free speech is not guaranteed to dissenting opinion in Britain. So not only do we not have an affinity with the democratic values of European states, as we have purported to do for the last 80 years, we're going to engage in frank criticism of the democratic performance of all of these people. And henceforth, the alliance across the Atlantic is an alliance of ideological conviction and depends on ideological conviction. If you don't share our particular political ideological values, you're out of luck. That's a world in which Václav Havel's appeal to human rights and democracy doesn't have an audience. They're speaking a different language, right? And so if he then goes and says to J.D. Vance or to the President of the United States, look, you know, something really terrible is happening in Ukraine. This is a sovereign European state that did not present a threat of any kind, military or otherwise, to Russia and has been invaded. And 1 million people have died, Mr. President, Vice President, and, you know, and it's extremely important as a matter of principle that you defend self-determination as a moral principle, as a human rights value. It's very important that you defend the inviolability of frontiers. These are universal principles, Mr. President, that are anchored in the UN Charter. That would be the language I think we can confidently think that Václav Havel will use. He would be met with an argument which uses a totally different language entirely, which is who's winning and who's losing. Who's got the cards? Remember that phrase? Who's got the cards and who doesn't have the cards? Okay? Right now, Zelensky, you don't have the cards, right? So it doesn't actually matter what principles you're defending. So the entire leverage that Václav Havel would have had in that conversation disappears because they're talking a different language. And I think it's very important for us, and I respect the language of Václav Havel deeply, but we do him no favors and we do ourselves no favors if we assume that language is current. Because the thing is truly shocking to me about American foreign policy is someone who, hey, loves the United States, was educated in the United States, and believes passionately in a certain America which has frankly disappeared. Václav Havel has no one to talk to in Washington now. And that should alarm all of us. And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks very much. You imagine Václav Havel at the Munich conference. I don't know what his response would have been, but certainly he would not start crying, which is what the chair of that conference, a very experienced German diplomat, broke down into tears. So I think with that, I pass on to, I don't know in what order, Martin Palouš, you want to start?
First of all, thank you for inviting me for this debates. I would start by thinking about Václav Havel and ideology. I fully agree that he was not driven by ideology, but by his experience. He had certainly ideas, but was able, I think, to think about these ideas and eventually change something confronted with his own experience. First thing, NATO enlargement. Just to be honest with facts, in the spring of 1990, Havel was the one who rather was sympathizing with OSCE. It was the Jiri proposal, and for him, dissolution of NATO was not a bad idea. And so when he...
After the dissolution of the Warsaw
No. Just let me finish. So when he traveled to Moscow that year, he was the first one, actually, and I agree with you in this, who said that that Warsaw Pact needs to be dissolved. Hungarians want to leave it. Soviets want to transform it into something, but he was speaking about leaving dissolving Warsaw Pact. Then his relationship to Gorbachev. I just remember 1999 when we were then traveling to summit of OSCE in Istanbul. There was a 10 years anniversary of Velvet Revolution, so there was a big party in Prague Castle. Bush was there, Valenza was there, Margaret Thatcher was there, Lech Valenza was there, Daniel Mitterrand, because François Mitterrand was already dead, but also Gorbachev. read about the communication between Gorbachev and Havel in 1999. Gorbachev was not loser for Havel, but he was a very decent partner in communication. So when Havel started to speak in favor of NATO enlargement, he did that very strongly, so I don't deny that, and he had an idea how this political architecture in Europe should be transformed. But he was driven, I think, by his experience and by what's happening on the ground. Second example, 1999, our entry into NATO in March of that year, and then Kosovo crisis, and I had the honor to accompany Václav Havel on his one-day trip to Tirana, from which we made a short trip to Pristina in a military helicopter, which was a step that was maybe his act of solidarity and understanding for all these all these Kosovars. They were in trouble, exposed to the daily horrors of the war. But at the same time, it was something not standard in the context of international relations, because obviously Kosovo till today is not recognized by all European countries. The outcome sometimes is not what we expect. So a situation, I remember there, I was then criticized by my boss, who was Jan Kavan, for a minister who had a different ideas how to resolve the problem. I was complaining that we didn't have a agreement or permission for Belgrade, which was the government of that country. I don't want to go into details, but here Havel, I think, took a very bold human rights initiative and all this complex situation in Kosovo. And the last one is 2003, last days of Václav Havel in office, and his decision to sign the letter of aid. It was Iraqi freedom operation. Germans and French were clearly on one side of the things. And Václav Havel decided, and I have to confess, I was the one through Washington who was sending him information, who decided to join other European leaders and do that. So it might, in my view, it might be a case where experience of Václav Havel has been tested later. He was not president anymore, because obviously the result of the operation Iraqi freedom was a very complicated thing. So I think that Václav Havel was ready to accept that he is a person who can make mistakes, but he was open-minded. He has ideas, he has principle, he has morality, he has defended human rights, but he was aware of the complexity of the world. So what he would be saying today, I agree with Mike, that it will be difficult to find partners for conversation with him all over the places. Here in the library, we are a great company of people. In the United States, there are also some, but in political circles, it might be a challenging thing.
Thank you very much. I have a number of things I would respond to. But Jiri, Pehe first.
Well, thank you. Well, I would start where Martin Palouš ended, with Havel's open-mindedness. I think that was one of the characteristics of his that were very interesting to me and very prominent, because we can mention that NATO project, which I still remember how he was, at the beginning of the 90s, he was pretty much convinced that there should be some pan-European security organization that would include Russia, and then he quickly or gradually embraced the idea that actually we need our security, as Michael Ignatieff said, for anchoring our democratic institutions, and that a pan-European security project is not what would really help us. What was really prominent in him and what has not changed over the years was his belief in human rights, of course. And I observed that for him, human rights was, it had two dimensions. It was sort of almost an enlightenment concept for him. Human rights were like natural laws, right? He was convinced that they are universal, that they are applicable to everyone, and if if you take Newton, the apple doesn't fall down differently in China and in the Czech Republic. So that was his concept of human rights, and that's why he promoted human rights. But at the same time, he was, of course, pragmatic, and he knew that he has to make concessions occasionally, and he did. That NATO example is, I think, it's very good. But also his relations with China. He would be looking for a position that would not be entirely hardline from his perspective. Like, I'm not going to talk to you because you violate human rights. He knew that there are certain interests that have to be taken into account. What I really like to remember about Havel was that this complexity. He was not just a former dissident who became a politician, but he was also an artist. And these three dimensions were always present in some way. So, for example, this is just an anecdote, but I think it illustrates very well how he was thinking. He came with this, I would say, a slightly dissident idea in 1999, I think, when he went to the French Senate to give a speech. And he decided that he would give a speech about how Europe, the European Union, should be transformed along the lines of the American system. That means that we would have a lower chamber of the European Parliament. We would have a Senate in which each country would have 2 senators. And we said, well, this is a great idea. I mean, we advisors, but if you go to France and you will make a speech about it, it may not be very well received. And he wouldn't make any concessions. He decided that this is how it will be, and he will make that speech. But about that very same speech, he would give it to us, and he would ask us to comment on the speech. So we all made comments and tried to gently prod him in the direction of sort of maybe mollifying some of those statements. And he read all of those comments, and then I noticed that he didn't include any of them. And so I went to him and I said, so was it so bad? Those comments were so bad? He said, no, you don't understand. My speech is like a symphony. If I take one note out, it will all collapse. And so I said, okay, have your speech, deliver it in the French Senate. And he actually did, and he got a 15-minute standing ovation. Because it was Václav Havel, right? So he could not do really anything wrong. But there was this dimension to his foreign policy which was always slightly dissident, because he really didn't want to engage in sort of the usual kind of business. He wanted to bring something new to the fore, and this was one example of it. But there were many occasions like that when he would choose to disagree with the prevailing point of view. And so Václav Havel has to be taken in his complexity, because there was always this dimension in him. When we went to the United States for the state visit during Bill Clinton's years, it was the peak of the Lewinsky affair, and Václav Havel decided that he would bring to the state dinner. He would bring Czech musician from his dissident years, Michaela Hlavsa, from the Plastic People of the Universe. And we said, this is not a good idea. This really, there's no way to. And he said, no, I want Velvet Underground to play there, and I want Michaela Hlavsa to play with them. So we were bringing Michaela Hlavsa with us, which was an experience that I will never forget. And just one more anecdote. we had to make a stop in Reykjavik because the plane wouldn't make it all the way to the United States, the Ilyushin, whatever it was. And the Czech delegation in the center of Reykjavik, the center of Reykjavik is basically a park. And there were mushrooms everywhere. And so the Czech delegation started picking mushrooms. Everyone had a plastic bag full of mushrooms. And we got to the plane, and the captain said, well, no way, they would arrest us in the United States. You have to leave it here. So we, with pain in our hearts, we left the mushrooms there. But of course, Vaclav Havel didn't. And so we arrived in Washington. Václav Havel already was on his way to his hotel, and we were all kept by the border officials because Vaclav Havel had some kind of substance that looked like drugs. And then Václav Havel said, okay, he's a dissident. It's fine. And then the state dinner started, and the Velvet Underground got on stage, and Vaclav Havel played with them. And I was sort of uneasy because I thought this is maybe too much. I was seated next to Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General at the time. And she was this very proper sort of WASP lady. She was sitting there like that. And then the Velvet Underground started playing. And Vaclav Havel got on stage. And I could see that her legs started moving to the rhythm. Then her other leg started moving. And Jaromír Jágr, famous Czech ice hockey player, was sitting next to her on the other side. And some people started dancing. So Jaromír Jágr went to Janet Reno. He said, should we dance? So, yeah, she started dancing with him. And it was amazing because something like that could not happen without Václav Havel. I said this was totally crazy, and he said this was so wonderful. This was so, this is how I imagine a state dinner. So that was Václav Havel, who always was coming up with new ideas, and always challenging things that were sort of routine and so on. He would have to come up with something new. And the same is true about foreign policy, where he, I think, came up with some interesting idea. Final remark, I think that he would, I'm absolutely in agreement about today's situation. I think he would be extremely unhappy. He wouldn't have anyone to communicate with in Washington. However, I think that would not stop him from being very vocal and being heard, because it would almost personally offend him what's going on in Washington. I remember when he gave his first speech, I wasn't there with him, but when he gave his first speech in Washington, there was a US senator who said, if I could speak like Havel, I would run for God. And so if now we have a God in Washington, right? Only that he doesn't speak like Havel. So.
Since you mentioned the speech in Paris, I was present, and for those who don't remember that, this was a speech about why Europe needs a constitution, and hence the idea of the two chambers, a chamber and a Senate. But it was not about America; it was about what Europe needs, and. It was a visionary speech. It surprised people. He also started by saying, what Europe needs is a constitution, a short text, clearly written, that everybody could understand, which was spell out the basic values of the European Union and the key institutions, the devolution of power. When we know what happened to the European Constitution, what cannot have, why didn't they let Václav Havel draft But that was the idea. He understood that Europe needs a text, not a pile of treaties. Of course, yes, the treaties are important. But yeah, there was always for him the symbolic moment. And yeah, he got a standing ovation, not just because he was Václav Havel, but also because he really was daring to breach a new subject. So that was, sorry, I must not, moderator must moderate himself. And I have a question for all of you. My first question would be to Michael. Okay, in the 1990s, the dominant approach by Havel and others vis-à-vis wars such as the war in former Yugoslavia was the idea that human rights are absolutely crucial, that ethnic cleansing is not acceptable in the post-89 Europe and things like that. At what point do you think the situation changed, the outlook changed, or the world changed, and suddenly this proposition, this kind of idea became questioned, gradually pushed aside, and today totally taboo? What happened? When do you think?
Well, I think 9/11 happened. I think Iraq happened. I think Libya happened. In other words, there was a period in which, in the Bosnian catastrophe, what was infuriating was the sense that Western powers could have stopped it. A universal language was there to say why it should be stopped. And remember that Luxembourg foreign minister said, "This is the hour of Europe." Well, we went through 4 years in which eventually it was the Americans who had to come and shift the military balance and get NATO to do some discrete targeted strikes and etc., and produce peace on the ground. And that gave a period of about 5 years, I think, when the idea of humanitarian intervention, that is linking the universal defense of human rights to the use of military force as a last resort. And that was in service of an ideal that you could use the power of states to prevent other states massacring their own people or allowing massacres to occur. But it was a very, very brief moment, freighted with a certain kind of hubris. I mean, because using the military instrument to defend human rights is a very, very dicey business. Anybody who remembers the use of airstrikes in the Kosovo War, for example, will remember that we hit some refugee convoys. We killed a lot of completely innocent people. The minute you use military power, you potentially damage human rights as much as you seek to protect it. And in this process, I think the legitimacy of human rights as the driving instrument of state power began to get lost. And then 9/11 happens, and this is a human rights atrocity, of course. 3,000 people are killed like that. But essentially, it's an act of war. It jumps out of the human rights paradigm altogether. And then Iraq is not a human rights battle at all. I mean, there were human rights grounds for deposing Saddam Hussein, which we tend to forget, which is that he was a horrible butcher. But not even I, who'd been to Iraq and seen what Saddam Hussein had done to the Kurds, believed you could justify military intervention because he was a human rights monster. The threshold condition was if he had weapons of mass destruction. If he did, then there was a case, but then that's not a human rights case. It's an international security case. And then you jump forward to Libya, where you have a human rights defense of military intervention led by Sarkozy and the British Prime Minister, in which, you know, the American president, Obama, looks at that and thinks, wait a minute, there's something about this making me uneasy, so I'll lead from behind. And it switches from a mission to protect civilians in Benghazi to becoming regime change. And Gaddafi ends up in a culvert being killed by his own people. So that story is a story of the ways in which the legitimacy of human rights slowly gets destroyed by its use as a justification for the exercise of military power. That would be the story I would tell. And then, and the relevance, I think, of 9/11 and everything that happened is suddenly national security becomes the defining criteria of state power for the United States at that point, and then subsequently. And then there's this domestic, you know, revolution in American politics, which we could talk about. But at the end of the day, I think human rights begins to die a death. And the other point I would make, again, it's very unpopular to say this, but I think one of the things that's shredded, you know, Havel's a great defender of the idea of moral universalism. I think this was the point you were making, that there are some things that are universally true. And you said at the beginning of this, ethics should drive international relations. Well, one of the things that's been persistently difficult in European politics have been universal human rights obligations to refugees and migrants that clash fundamentally with the domestic electoral resistance of populations to accept more populations. And in other words, a clash between, this is what makes it tough, a clash between democratic sovereignty, this is what the people want, and universal obligation to strangers in difficulty. And the two are in conflict. There's just no question about it. And I think that's one of the drivers behind the slow waning of human rights effectiveness in international politics. Why? Because no politician in their right mind is going to defy the expressed electoral wishes of an electorate for the sake of some universal principle. Right? I'm not comfortable saying any of this, but I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, that would be a big discussion. I would introduce a distinction between people who flee from a war or from a dictatorship and people who are migrants for economic reasons. Their human dignity is the same. There's no question about that. But I would still make that distinction because, in fact, the Convention on Refugees, the 1950 Geneva Convention, it was a human rights principle. If you include all forms of migration under that principle, well, you might have done it out of generous motives, but would destroy the Human Rights Convention. Yeah.
First, just word of entertainment. Just have to react to what Jiri said about this dance. Mela Hlavsa and Lou Rito were playing, but a photograph where Václav Havel is dancing with Hillary Clinton. It was not maybe also Jagger and Reno, but Václav Havel himself with Hillary Clinton. And they were really good dancers. It looks like that. And then interesting thing was that it was not so much covered by the press, because the press was fully concentrated on Monica Lewinsky's case. That was a #1 issue in the United States in that moment. So this was out. But to this human rights question, I think that we need to take into consideration new conflicts that were appearing in the world in a new era. And so within these new conflicts, I think humanitarian law is maybe more a relevant instrument than human rights international conventions, which means protection of civilians in armed conflicts and capability to make a distinction between right for self-defense and excessive use of force, and capability to make a distinction between civilians and non-civilians, and so on and so forth. So Václav Havel certainly was exposed, as everybody else, to these situations. I think that he was thinking about that in many ways. It was already started here with Bosnia, where these questions were really very hot and topical, and you can go one conflict after another, especially Middle East and everywhere else, where these questions were coming, and Havel had to deal with that with his, and I would clearly say, maybe limited formal education in all these areas, surrounded by his advisors, but still in the end, I think, always led by his intuitions and instincts, and ready to correct himself if something got wrong. Obviously, this US discussion after 9/11, we stand united, and first the security. It was very natural that no one exactly knew what kind of threat United States and Western civilization was exposed to. So Havel was on the right side of the things, for sure, but obviously it was only Havel, I would say.
No, I think this point you're making about the distinction between humanitarian and human rights engagement is important. Although they were connected historically, you know, in '68, Bernard Kouchner starts Doctors Without Borders. There is a famine in Biafra. Doctors, you know, it's on humanitarian grounds. The same people who got engaged then, later, during, for instance, during Bosnia, but during other conflicts, suddenly started using the language of human rights. And so the two are intertwined, but I think the distinction is very important. I don't know whether Jiri has something you want to add, and after that we open it to...
No, I just want to say that this maybe we should not condemn entirely this concept of humanitarian intervention. Certainly, if Václav Havel, in case of Iraq, because when he was talking about Iraq, and I had those conversations with him, his initial position was that the West should intervene because there are mass violations of human rights, and it should be a humanitarian intervention. And then he signed a letter which didn't mention any of that, basically. It was a letter that was based on all of those false claims that there were nuclear weapons and things, which somehow tarnished his reputation. I remember that my good friend Tony Judd wrote a number of very critical articles about Václav Havel's signing this letter, because, and I think that if Havel stayed with his original position, he would not have signed that letter, I have to say. And I have to some extent side here with Tony Judd. I don't think that it was the wisest decision he's ever made.
Very short remark. I think that what was most important thing in this situation was, I think, Resolution 1441 from the fall of previous year, that had this formula that there will be serious consequences if something doesn't happen. And then U.S. argument was that they deployed already large contingents there, and obviously weather was coming from January to hotter months, and that would be absolutely unacceptable just to move them back without doing something. That was the main argument. So human rights were not there so much, but believe that Western presence there can start regime change or a path for Iraqi democracy.
Yeah. Well, we could go on about this. I remember asking him also about Iraq, and his first he was, the fall of a dictatorship cannot be a bad thing. Sure, I agree. But then, even if you don't have, you intervene without UN a resolution on false claims, etc. That would be a different discussion. But that's an old debate. You know, you're doing the wrong things for the right reasons, so to speak. That would be, let's say, Havel's take, or let's say my defense of his position, which I regretted at the time. Anyway, we now have time for questions and comments from you. So, any volunteers? Any? There is one. Yes.
Hi, may I ask, how do you think Europe, now that the United States has decided that it won't really intervene in, let's say, like foreign conflicts and foreign like problems, how do you think the European Union should act as like a maybe guarantor of like humanitarian rights, and how do you think the European Union should kind of fill this vacuum that's been created maybe by the like now the absence of the United States in diplomacy?
It's a good question, and I think the hard answer is that Europe can't replace what's been lost. It is straining to meet the military needs of the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. So its capacity to replace the United States as a supplier of security is limited in the European theater, and it's not limited forever, but it's going to take 5 years, 10 years for Europe to develop the capabilities that allow Europe to defend itself. And that's going to put enormous pressure on the budgets of most European states, and it's putting a big pressure on even the Canadian budget. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I don't think there was a problem about Europe being a free rider. There's a problem about Canada being a free rider. On the humanitarian side, which is the focus of your question, you know, the United States USAID, which has been shut, you know, was a crucial guarantor of funding for things like healthcare in African states, the battle against AIDS in Southern Africa. I have heard analyses, and these are which are especially interesting, which is that when outside aid drops out, it forces regimes in Africa to change, to take up the slack. So one answer to the question is it is in Europe and it is in the United States. It's going to be African states are going to have to decide, we have got to fund primary health care. There are many African states where through the 90s and through the 2000s, right up to 2023, 50% of the health budget in some of the countries was provided by external sources. Some of it European, some not. So it's not, I don't want to push this argument too far. There are some consequences here that may be positive. That is, it boosts the self-reliance of African states and some Latin American states. But I just don't see Europe stepping in. I think many of the Scandinavian countries have wonderful foreign aid programs. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, pretty fantastic. But I don't think they can scale to the size that can replace what's been left by the United States. And China, the other big player, is not in that business. It's in infrastructure and building railways and stuff, but it's not going to step in and meet the humanitarian needs of these developing nations. So it's not great out there.
Well, Europe may not be able to step in let's say, in Africa as well, but it has to confront stepping in the conflict in Ukraine in its own backyard, because it's in this case its own security is involved. So that suddenly Europeans are confronted with something. Incidentally, Havel was among the first who really got interested in the Ukrainian case. I remember at the time of the Orange Revolution, I did a sort of lengthy interview, only part of which I published in Le Monde. But this was after the Orange Revolution. And I asked him, do you see similarities with 1989, with the Velvet Revolution? And he says, well, there are similarities. You know, people turn out on the main square and they come every day until the government goes away. Okay, so this is a superficial analogy, but otherwise it's different. In what way? 1989 was revolutions against communism. Orange Revolution is revolution against post-communism. I asked him, well, what is post-communism? And he says, it's a mixture of a semi-authoritarian state and mafia capitalism. So, yeah, he had insights very early on into the Ukrainian situation. And similarly, about what will happen to Ukraine, I asked him, and he says, well, Ukraine, as its very name says, it's on the borderline between different influences, cultural, historical, etc. And we cannot decide it, but nobody else should be able, it is their choice which way they want to go. So that was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. Well, he was onto something. Anybody else? Comments? Yes?
Hello. Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I'm a journalist from the US and I admire all of you very much. My question is, how do you think Havel would respond to the weaponization of artificial intelligence and social media as a means of destabilizing democratic alliances and democracies?
Well, obviously now the question is in which role, as a president or as a writer, playwright with a sense for absurdity. I remember his relationship with machines, and you can start with a normal computer and typewriter, but complicated. I remember him sitting in the Congressional Library. He was a stipend there, and he almost had a problem just to touch on a keyboard and how to write ash with Háček, how to switch, all sorts of things. So certainly he was not a great fan of artificial intelligence, even in this very primitive state. I think that he would be afraid, and he would be trying to mobilize everything with the question, are we going really to become slaves of these things or these machines, instruments that pretend to serve us? I think that he is certainly friend of normal language, language of human beings, and not all these things that come up from computers and so on and so forth. So I think that he will be raising this question very high, and if he were a politician, I think that he would certainly try to initiate some proper legislation on whatever level, national level, European level. So I think artificial intelligence would be for him a great, I would say, warning.
Yes. Well, you know, Havel, in a number of his essays and speeches, talked about what he called the dull self-motion of the industrial civilization. And basically what he meant was that the industrial civilization has been propelled by technology and science without any real control of humans. Of course, he was very deeply influenced by Heidegger on that, how technology and science can enslave us if we somehow are unable to control it. And I think that he would be really appalled today by what's going on. There have been numerous calls on the international scene to regulate the development of the artificial intelligence, and nothing has happened. And I can already I can hear him musing about this, talking about this, and it would certainly be he would be alarmed by what's going on, and maybe he would write a play about the end of mankind.
Well, he wrote, if you recall, about a development on technological grounds with a new machine of a new language called Pehe. And you know, that was in the 60s. So he, I think part of his answer to this question is already there in that play from the 60s.
What I would just add on exactly on the point of language is I think a person, we've talked about his artistic temperament, and I think it's very important. It's what made him such a unique figure. But one of the aspects of him was his acute sensitivity to language and the meaning of language, the use of language. And I think one of the things he might look at, maybe I'm putting words in his in his vanished mouth, is the language we use about artificial intelligence. We're calling it intelligence. It's not at all clear that this is intelligence. It's computation. There's no question it's computation. It's inferential algorithmic computation is what it is. It's not clear it's intelligence at all. And what he might be worried about is the ways in which we're allowing the people who define this language and use this language to expropriate from us our very conception of what it is to be an intelligent human agent. And it's a serious matter. I mean, they talk about learning. It's not clear that this is learning. This is ingestion of vast amounts of data. Fine, it's very impressive technologically. But the anthropomorphic language used is a systematic barrier to understanding what the hell is going on, and also a threat to our sense of what it is to have an intelligence, a threat to what our sense of learning is, a sense of, I mean, and I think, unless I'm missing something, that because he was a deep humanist, he'd be extremely concerned about that issue.
Can I add something? I think that here in this library, they already made a horrifying experiment. Andulka Freimanova, I think, knows about that. They asked artificial intelligence to write a Havel play. And it did, and it really sounded very convincingly. So I would like to know what Václav Havel himself would say that something like that is producing Havelian products.
Yeah. Yes, we have time for this.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I may just have a little question. You mentioned the evolution of the diplomacy of the values on the global scale. How would you say at the scale of the Czech Republic, how did Czech Republic evolve in the field of diplomacy of the values, Havelian diplomacy, since Havel left the power?
Well, diplomacy of values after Havel. I don't know. We have a diplomat here, so
diplomats always need to behave diplomatically. First of all, second, diplomats, and I don't want to be too self-critical, are born opportunists, which mean they want to keep certain continuity in foreign policies when things are changing. So Havel was a very, I would say, intensive source of information, but always there was a certain tension between the executive branch of government led by the prime minister and the president. You know, president here sits in this beautiful castle, so he's a little bit like a constitutional emperor. And he could come with inspirations, but to transform these inspirations to practical action of foreign policies, it was something else. And obviously, I think that you still can find a lot of Havelian disciples and loyalists and people who have been changed in their life by encounter with Havel. But on the side, other side, you find others who need to explain to themselves why don't they like Havel, because Havel was putting them into complicated situations, and so on and so forth. So I think Havel's role in that area was tremendous, inspirational, but still with the under condition that you have to turn it in yourself, decision-making processes, your own responsibility, and not just to be a Havelian opportunist or someone who wants only to coordinate himself with Havelian instructions.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the development of Czech politics in the last 3 decades, obviously there's a point which could be even identified, I think, quite precisely when when the politics, at least on the government level, started diverting from Havel's legacy. Right? It was first this idea that we should not pursue Havel's human rights ideas. It should not be applied to Czech foreign policy and so on. And it basically stayed throughout the presidency of Miloš Zeman. Now it's sort of the opposite, right? We now have the president who sort of says that is sort of influenced by Havel's legacy, and we will have a government soon that certainly will not be. But I think that it is still here. When in civil society, whenever you have a big demonstration or some kind of event that comes from civil society, there's always there are always references to Havel, and everyone. And with time, I think it's on that level, it's even stronger. Maybe because on the government level, it's now absent.
Very good point. The politics of value in society or parts of society, even when it disappears from the governmental sphere. We perhaps have time for yes.
I would go back to history and to Havel and suggest something you might agree with, maybe not. And that is, certain times have their character, their spirit, so to say, their color, their smell. And Havel was a creator of something I would call Havel's moment. And that was the 90s. But the definition of that came immediately, 89, 90, 91. That was the decisive moment when he, not also with the others of the change of 89, inspired people in the Old West. that created an atmosphere which made it so electrifying when Havel went to America and gave his speech in Congress. Any speeches after that, the audience in America was just flat on its back, and so on. That meant, of course, that Havel's influence, but also his opportunity to do something himself, was immense. So, to that time, the defined time, this moment, belongs also the behavior of Russia. You mentioned that there are other agencies than just America. One of the agencies of that time was Russia, but a very different Russia. It was something that's, if you think back, it's confusing. It's not Putin's Russia there. You had the Russian officials coming to Prague, and I remember one of the top Russian and previously Soviet politicians came to Prague, and there was the long diplomatic table. And we were all sitting there, and Havel came in at a certain moment. And this Russian politician blushed. He was stupefied. There was somebody, a pope, a god, or something like that. This was for a Soviet politician. And it wasn't only that. The Russians were seriously thinking about how to accommodate, how to fit in. We forget that today. There was an occasion when Foreign Minister Kozyrev came to visit. He's now happy, emigrated to the United States. He was invited by Havel to accompany him to Hradeček, his weekend house. And there he asked Havel, do you think that we could join the European Union? Can you imagine Putin asking something like that? And Havel explained to him that he didn't think that was a good idea. It wouldn't work. It would destroy Europe and it would destroy Russia, because it's a different area. Civilizational, cultural area. So this is the West, this is Russia, and it's needed to find solutions next to each other. I'm saying this because I find that it's very important to know that in the 90s, everything was different. So part of that was the atmosphere in which the talk about human rights was done. And the humanitarian intervention, the idea, came from something that happened in the early 90s. And it hasn't been mentioned. That was Rwanda. A terrible thing that happened, and the terrible thing that created a feeling of guilt in the Western world. We were hopeless, we didn't do anything, and there was nearly 1 million people slaughtered. And that was one of the impulses then that led to this humanitarian intervention thinking at all. And that was connected then with the issue of human rights generally and what to do with it and responsibility and so on.
Very short comment. I agree with you that the 1990s was a very specific moment, but I think that some sort of deeper transformation, and Havel was aware of it, started way before. Jacques in this moment mentioned also the problem with refugees. But the capability to make distinction between political refugees a long time ago with nonsense passports and then taken care by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and those who are refugees, I would say, combined with some sort of economic reason, but political as well. Obviously having their concerns about the safety of their kids, so it's very difficult now to make these distinctions. Michael mentioned Mersheimer's point of view. I met him once in Chicago at Northwestern University, and I was shocked by that. He said, you know, bipolarity had certain virtues. And the virtues of bipolarity was predictability. The fact that all these new conflicts were, I would say, under control of these red lines connecting the great powers. I mean, we really have stepped voluntarily and with our flags waving our freedom to a very uncertain world. And Václav Havel was maybe one of those who had an open mind to talk about that, that he knew that the small Czech Republic, even if Havel is a kind of philosopher king combined with playwright king, that he could not do everything, that he can only start initiating, provoking people so that certain communication is going on. I remember he once wrote, what I'm doing among all these world leaders and politicians, do they take me seriously? Or am I some sort of clown among them? He himself asked himself this question, because obviously he was not able often to follow the routines and these sometimes flattening type of communications, and he tried to use all sorts of opportunities to provoke them, to let them, give them opportunity to think. And the question is, do politicians think, or do they react to their own impulses?
Well, you ask a difficult question at the very end, and we will not answer it tonight. We have to conclude now. Before I thank our guests, I want to say something that perhaps we didn't sufficiently dwell on, and which is of importance in Havel's legacy, and that is his view of Europe. And that, I mean, I won't read it to you. I have this quote about his definition of European values. You want to know what European values are supposed to be? Well, look up his speech in Strasbourg on 16th of February 2000. You have there, in one paragraph, the clearest and most convincing definition of what we stand for, what Europe stands for. So that's important, and it's important in two respects. At least one is what happened to Central Europe. Havel was a founder, the inventor of the Visegrad Group. It was not even called Visegrad. He went to the Polish Sejm in January 1990, and there he outlined the idea why the Central Europeans should cooperate. And there was a meeting in Bratislava where in 90, which was a follow-up, and that led to the founding of Visegrad. And I think what the situation we have now in Central Europe, with Orban, Fico, I will not dare mention others, but you can. Sunny, the situation is different, and it concerns what Europe can do about it. And I will not launch the discussion now, but I will just give you his hint about Central Europe. You know, there was this project of the Italian foreign minister of the Pentagonale early in the 90s. And then it became hexagonale to include Poland. And so it went until there were 14 members. It was called the Central European Initiative. And they just brought in Macedonia. And so I asked Havel, what do you think? You know, is Macedonia part of Central Europe? And he answered, there are institutions that perish out of excessive politeness. The inability to tell them. And I then asked him, then, do you think it may apply to the European Union as well? He said, it cannot be ruled out. So that was his thing. That, you know, sometimes you actually have to assert those values, and you have to say no to people if the project is at stake. And final word, I would say, since Havel is no longer there to articulate, I mean, Havel was famous throughout Europe for outlining this vision. We mentioned the Paris speech about the European Constitution. Nobody was perhaps paying too much attention to it here. And what strikes me is that there is really nobody on the Czech political scene today capable of articulating a Czech view of why Europe. What do we expect from Europe? What is a Czech view of the European project? And I haven't seen anybody since Havel capable of doing so. So that's why we go back to what he had to tell us on the subject and on human rights and everything else. I want to thank our speakers, particularly Michael Ignatieff, for coming here tonight. You know, great liberal thinker, writing about Havel. Since we know each other, I know his interest in Havel goes back a long way. Martin Palouš, experienced diplomat, but who fortunately doesn't speak like a diplomat. And our friend Jiri Pehe, who has been in charge of NYU, and now he's liberated and therefore can speak about things, whatever he wants. Anyway, thank you to all three. Thank you to you for your good question.